Okay, so today we're going to be talking about a book written in the 18th century, around the founding of this country, the United States, called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, I haven't looked up exactly when this was published. The copy that I have here is a part of a larger book. The introduction is stamped and is dated February 14th of 1776. So this just gives us an idea of the period in which it was written. And this is a book considered to be one of the seminal books of the American experience. And so he begins here with the discussion of the origin and design of government in general, with concise remarks on the English Constitution. Okay, so we're going to begin here with this first paragraph. Some writers have so confounded society with government as to leave little or no distinction between them, whereas they are not only different, but have different origins. Society is produced by our wants, and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively, by uniting our affections. The latter, negatively, by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. The first is a patron, the last is a punisher. So I hesitate here to pause to discuss this opening paragraph, because I know that he goes into greater detail in subsequent paragraphs. But I suppose that it does warrant some thought. And so what we see here is the distinction between society and government. That's a society is produced by our wants, our desires. The mind that is not satisfied to be is not capable of obtaining its desires through its own efforts, so it must collectivize. It must organize itself into a collective, a society. Now there is this difference, a different institution, an institution that is built within society, called government. And here Mr. Paine says, government is produced by our wickedness, by the very thing that is antagonistic to promote our happiness, the thing that leads us to society in the first place, the pathology, the parasites that proliferate and feed off of society. These sorts of things comprise our wickedness. And whereas society promotes our happiness positively by facilitating our desires, and I don't want to seem to suggest that our desires is the only reason that we form a society. Or rather, I should say, I don't want the opinion to be that our desires are purely superficial, or that they are purely material. I wholly recognize that we can have quite substantial desires, a desire for love, for example, a love that is more than purely the material, the sexual. And so he says, the society promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, by unifying us into a collective. And the government, it does this negatively. It unites us negatively. It restrains our vices. Now, the restraint of vices by itself, in my mind, does not sound like a bad thing. Where the negativity comes in is that it is done so by force. That as a collective, we have to establish a right and wrong for the collective to adhere together. Because you can imagine that if there were no restraint on our vices, and a society found itself in a Sodom and Gomorrah type position, where the negative elements of our soul, let's say, or character, are manifest, and that we pursue the desires of the flesh, we pursue the more superficial things of value, we pursue the unethical, the insult upon our moral virtues, then we will find ourselves in a society that is eroding, that is decaying, that becomes violent, that begins to break apart. And in this sense, we need something. We need an establishment of laws, and the enforcement of which is negative. It is purely top-down. It is power. It is control. It is the control of these vices. He goes on to say that society encourages intercourse. It encourages us to come together. But the other creates distinctions. It says, yes, you may come together, but you may not do this. You may not do this to another person. You may not go here and do this. The first is a patron, the last is a punisher. Society, in every state, is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one, for when we suffer, or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which you might expect in a country without government, our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. So beautiful language here. Let's unpack this. Society in every state is a blessing. Now, I don't want to make this commentary as a critique to the opinions of Mr. Paine. I want to explore what I believe that he means to the fullest extent. The critique and the judgment, although a few may find themselves slipping through into this commentary, will remain the object of others. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. A necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one, for when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without government, or a state of chaos, perhaps, in which men rule over us through power, corruption, coercion. We are subjected by the spirit of fear. Our calamity is heightened by reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer. The reason that we suffer is the very institution that we designed to protect us. And you can imagine that if you spent and suffered much of your life, spent much of your money, perhaps investing in something that turned out to be negative, it became a poison, and it slowly robbed you of your enjoyment, of your happiness, of your desires, of your human experience. This would create suffering. This is suffering. It would create an existential crisis. one would ask themselves, why are we here? Why did we do this? What is the point? Where is God in this? Government, like dress, is a badge of lost innocence. So here, a biblical reference. That is, we clothe ourselves because we are aware of our nakedness. It's in the very awareness that we must accept this badge of lost innocence, our fallen nature. The palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise. So it's always exciting when you find a statement that is limited in terms of its word count, but quite expansive in its meaning. And I think that this statement here, the palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise, is just one of those. And so what I think this means is that a palace of a king is built upon an earlier union, an earlier society that was established under the canopy which provides the shade, which in turn provide a state of paradise for mankind. And the king comes in and built itself on top of its ruins. And so we have this sort of illustration of a society that has fallen, but the king has taken place to restore the ruins, or to usurp the whatever institutional capacity that existed before. And again, this is very reminiscent of the Old Testament, in which God is very resistant to the idea of a king over Israel. He sort of reluctantly accepts a king over Israel after Israel does as they please. Of course, there are good kings. There are kings that in the Old Testament are given favor. But the overall idea and the institution of the kingship was negative in the eyes of the divine, in the eyes of God. 4. Were the impulses of conscience clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver. But that not being the case, he finds it necessary to surrender up a part of his property to furnish means for the protection of the rest. So, of course, what we see here is an implication that the impulses of conscience are not clear. They're not readily understood by the multitude. They're not unified. They don't come to a central point. And they are not irresistibly obeyed. People fall into a variety of states, a variety of ways of being. And not all of these ways of being are conducive to a strong collective, because they can pull in the opposite direction. They can pull towards disunity. And everyone that does that pulls away from the concise, the clear, uniform, puts the stability of the society at risk. And so because of this, we need the lawgiver. We find it necessary to surrender up a part of our property. We pay our taxes so that we can have the protection. The rest can be protected from the line at the gate, from the invading army, from the internal dissension that might threaten our lives, that might threaten our families, that may even attempt to rob us of our very life. And this he is induced to do the same. And this he is induced to do by the same prudence which, in every other case, advises him out of two evils to choose the least. So, out of concern for the future, we are induced to choose the least out of the two evils: the multiplicity, the unrestrained vices, or the restrained vices that are restrained by the institution of government. Wherefore, security being the true design and end of government, it unanswerably follows that whatever form thereof appears most likely to ensure it to us with the least expense and greatest benefit is preferable to all others. So if we choose government, we have to pick the form of government that is most likely to ensure it to us with the least expense and greatest benefit to all. And what it ensures is that security, that protection, the restraint of vices. And so the obvious question is, what is the optimal? How do we do it? In order to give a clear and just idea of the design and end of government, let us suppose a small number of persons settled in some sequestered part of the earth, unconnected with the rest. They will then present the first peopling of any country, or of the world. In this state of natural liberty, society will be their first thought. 1,000 motives will excite them thereto. The strength of one man is so unequal to his wants, and his mind so unfitted to the perpetual solitude, that he is soon obliged to seek assistance and relief of another, who in his turn requires the same. 4 or 5 united would be able to raise a tolerable dwelling in the midst of a wilderness. But one man might labor out of the common period of life without accomplishing anything. When he had felled his timber, he could not remove it, nor erect it after it was removed. Hunger, in the meantime, would urge him from his work, and every different want call him a different way. So again, hunger in the meantime would urge him from his work, and every different want call him a different way. Disease, nay, even misfortune, would be death. For though he might be mortal, yet either would disable him from living, and reduce him to a state in which he might rather said to perish than die. Okay, so a beautiful analogy here by Mr. Paine. So he's trying to give us a clear idea of the design and end of government, which he alluded to in the last paragraph. Or rather, he proposed a sort of question that asks, what is the design of government that most likely ensures our security and the restraint of these vices at the least expense and greatest benefit, and that it's preferable to all? So now we have this illustration here of a person or a group of people that find themselves on some unsettled territory. Perhaps they are the first people to design a human civilization. It's a natural state of liberty, free from all institutions. A state of anarchy, if you like. They say society will be their first thought, a coming together, a collective, a unity of sorts. And 1,000 motives will come to mind that that bring them together. And he cites here a sort of Hayekian, of course this is much before Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, but this is reminiscent of some of Hayek's political thought, that the strength of one man is so unequal to his wants. And so we can hear the echoes of Hayek here in terms of the emergent economy in a free society, of the interaction of the elements that provide for each other based on their wants and their desires and their needs. But Mr. Paine here, he continues and he says his mind is so unfitted for perpetual solitude. And I think that's a perfect addition to the statement that man is so unequal to his wants. Because this perpetual solitude is not just something that produces material desires. It is a desire for more, for the connection with others, for love. So he's soon obliged to seek assistance and relief of another, who in his turn requires the same. So again, this Hayekian idea of an emergent economy in which people provide services for one another based on their own will, their own desires and needs. So 4 or 5 people might get together, and they might be able to raise a tolerable dwelling in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of no stability, no institutions. But one man alone would have extreme difficulty with this, because once he commits himself to one pursuit, cutting down a tree to gather timber for fire or for building a shelter for himself, hunger strikes him immediately, and this calls him away from that task. Perhaps disease finds him. There's no way he can heal it. He's still responsible for feeding himself, for making his shelter. There's no one else there that can help him with his health, that can heal his ailing body. And Mr. Paine says, this disease, this unfortunate circumstance, that may not just be disease, but whatever unfortunate circumstance, is possible to disable him from living, and reduce him to a state in which he might rather be said to perish rather than die. And what an interesting distinction there between perish and die. Because to die, it seems to be implied here that it is larger. There's a greater volume of possibility in terms of dying. Because when we die, we don't always perish. We don't die under harsh circumstances. We don't die in pain. Many times we do. But certainly sometimes we don't die in pain. Sometimes we die in a hospital room with our family and our loved ones around us. Sometimes we die at home, under the care of hospice, not in pain. But yet, in this new state, this new society, or the lack thereof, a man may perish because of the unfortunate harsh conditions of life and of nature. Thus, necessity, like a gravitating power, would soon form our newly arrived emigrants into society, the reciprocal blessings of which would supersede and render the obligations of law and government unnecessary, while they remain perfectly just to one another. But as nothing but heaven is impregnable to vice, it will unavoidably happen that in proportion as they surmount the difficulties of emigration, which bound them together in a common cause, they will begin to relax in their duty and attachment to each other. And this reminiscence will point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to supply the defect of moral virtue. So correction on that last sentence. And this remissness will point out the necessity of establishing some form of government to supply the defect of moral virtue. So let's explore this. He continues with his analogy here. Thus necessity, like a gravitating power, would soon form our newly arrived emigrants into society, the reciprocal blessings of which would supersede and render the obligations of law and government unnecessary while they remain perfectly just to one another. In other words, we don't need the institution of government to restrain our vices if we have none, if we are perfectly just to one another. But as nothing but heaven, the divine authority, is impregnable to vice, it's unavoidable that vice will sneak in. That in proportion as they surmount the difficulties of emigration, which bound them together in a common cause, they will begin to relax in their duty and attachment to each other. And it's within this relaxation, within the relieving of the restraints of those burdens that were placed on us in a state of nature that led us to perish rather than die, it's within this very relief that we find the corruption or the defect of moral virtue begin to come in to the picture, which necessitates the creation of an institution to control it, to stop it from its proliferation, to design a government, in other words. Some convenient tree will afford them a state house, under the branches of which the whole colony may assemble to deliberate on public matters. It is more than probable that their first laws will have the title only of regulations, and be enforced by no other penalty than public disesteem. In this first parliament, every man, by natural right, will have a seat. So now our hypothetical collective has afforded themselves a state house in which the colony assembles to deliberate on public matters. He says it's probable that the first laws will only have the title of regulations, and the penalty will be that of low esteem. It will not be imprisonment. It will not be the forfeiture of property. It will be the public, the negative opinion of the public that is the penalty. That weighs heavy on the individual that violates the regulations, because they are part of this small collective, and therefore any action that they take to violate the security of the collective will be more acutely felt by this individual than, say, in a country of 300 and some million people. In this first parliament, every man by natural right will have a seat. But as the colony increases, the public concerns will increase likewise, and the distance at which the members may be separated will render it too inconvenient for all of them to meet on every occasion as at first, when their number was small, their habitations near, and the public concerns few and trifling. This will point out the convenience of our consenting to leave the legislative part to be managed by a select number chosen from the whole body, who are supposed to have the same concerns at stake which those have who appointed them, and who will act in the same manner as the whole body would were they present. If the colony continue increasing, it will become necessary to augment the number of representatives, and that the interests of every part of the colony may be attended to, it will be found best to divide the whole into convenient parts, each part sending its proper number, and that the elected might never form to themselves an interest separate from the electors. Prudence will point out the propriety of having elections often, because as the elected might by that means return and mix again with the general body of the electors in a few months, their fidelity to the public will be secured by the prudent reflection of not making a rod for themselves. And as this frequent interchange will establish a common interest with every part of the community, they will mutually and naturally support each other, and on this, not on the unmeaning name of king, depends the strength of government and the happiness of the governed. So here we have the progression of scale. Okay. Now we can see, as we follow this illustration, from the first inhabitants, from one man to a collective, to the very justification of a collective, into some form of establishing. Let me back up. So to form the collective, the relief of the natural burdens that weigh us down, that prevent us from fulfilling our wants, our desires. And in doing so, the infiltration of the defect of our moral virtue and the increase in the necessity of a governing body to control this. Now this collective becomes successful. They've come together to deliberate, and they begin to prosper. They begin to have children. They begin to spread out. And public concerns change. The seat at which they deliberate on public matters now becomes farther and farther removed as people begin to continue to have offspring and to move away from that site of deliberation, from that state house. This will point out the convenience of their consenting to leave the legislature part to be managed by a select number chosen from the whole body, who are supposed to have the same concerns at stake which those have who appointed them, and who will act in the same manner as the whole body would were they present. So again, the people that move away, they say they elect somebody from their local body to represent them as a part of this whole. So you begin to see this scale, the scale of representation, into the larger and larger unifying authority of the state. And an interesting reflection here is where the power, or the degrees of power, should rest within these varying degrees of representation and institutional bodies that receive these representatives from the smaller collectives that represent these people, that choose to represent, that choose the people to represent them. If the colony continue increasing, it will become necessary to augment the number of representatives, to increase the number of representatives, and that the interest of every part of the colony may be attended to. It will be found best to divide the whole into convenient parts, each part sending its proper number, and that the elected might never form them to themselves an interest separate from the electors. It's important that we have frequent elections, because as the elected might by that means return and mix again with the general body of the electors in a few months, their fidelity to the public or their responsibility to the public will be secured by the prudent reflection of not making a rod for themselves, not making a decision in their own interest, because their own interests are fundamentally designed or in parallel with their constituents or the people that they represent, because they are of that body. That's why it's so important to have appropriate representation. And now it's difficult not to reflect on how this has played out in our current day and why it may not be as functional as it could be otherwise. But we will get there in time. And as this frequent interchange will establish a common interest with every part of the community, they will mutually and naturally support each other. And on this, not on the unmeaning name of the king, depends the strength of government and the happiness of the governed. He continues, here, then, is the origin and rise of government, namely, a mode rendered necessary by the moral virtue to govern the world. Here, too, is the design and end of government, viz. Freedom and security. And however our eyes may be dazzled with show, or our ears deceived by sound, however prejudice may warp our wills, or interest darkened our understanding, the simple voice of nature and reason will say, it is right. So, another poetic paragraph here by Mr. Paine. Here, then, is the original and rise of government, namely, a mode rendered necessary by the moral virtue to govern the world. So it is within this moral virtue itself that is looking out for itself, that is trying to avoid the defect that comes from the loosening of the restraints of nature that lead us to perish. Here too is the design and end of government, viz. Freedom and security, that allows us to operate freely in society without an arbitrary authority over us. We have elected representatives from our own local environment that can vouch for us, that can relay the complaints of the locale, that can tell the rest of the whole of the body to say that this locale is in danger. Now, of course, the interesting question that comes up here is, what responsibility does the collective, that is the collective of representatives, have to the whole? Of course, to secure freedom and to promote the security of individuals' rights. But what are these rights? How are they to enforce this? And if this whole thing is rendered necessary by the moral virtue to govern, then this must be the most finest, the most delicate of objects. Because in the very execution of controlling, of executing a law that is negative, in the sense that it is prohibitory, saying explicitly, you cannot do this, you have to step through, or we have to step through a maze, a moral maze as so not to shatter the fragile veneer that unites us together. Of course, a strong moral virtue on the part of the electors will ensure a stronger execution of the laws, and most importantly, a stronger inception, a more just conception of the laws. And however our eyes may be dazzled with show, or our ears deceived by sound, however prejudice may warp our wills, or interest darken our understanding, the simple voice of nature and reason will say, "It is right." So, what he's saying here, I think, is that there will be no shortage as our society increases in complexity, as we continue to proliferate, to have children, to design institutions and corporate bodies. There's no shortage of things that will dazzle us, that will deceive our ears by sound. Our opinions may warp our wills, or darken our understanding. The simple voice of nature and reason will be the thing that tells us what is right and what is wrong. And of course, the important thing here is what is nature and what is reason. But that is for another time.